A kind black teenager helps an old woman fix a clock that was left behind by her late husband. Eddie thinks his good deed is complete until the next day when Mrs. Marlene arrives with a police officer and knocks on his door. When he learns the reason behind this unexpected visit, Eddie's life is changed forever. Eddie Jenkins pedaled his bike down Riverside's tree-lined avenues, the warm afternoon sun casting dappled shadows across his path. For the 15-year-old, these lazy rides through his neighborhood were a treasured routine, a moment to unwind after school and breathe in the familiar sights and sounds of Riverside, a quiet, tight-knit community where everybody knew one another, at least by sight, if not by name. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass, mingling with the faint whiffs of baked goods drifting from Miss Calderon's bakery on the corner. Eddie rounded the curve onto Elm Street, glancing at the row of quaint houses he knew by heart. That's when he noticed Mrs. Marlene Parker, hunched over something on her front porch. A look of frustration etched across her face. Mrs. Marlene was a fixture in the neighborhood. Her husband had passed some years back, and though she once spent her days tending to her beautiful garden and chatting with neighbors, Eddie noticed lately that she'd become more withdrawn, her once cheerful demeanor replaced by quiet solitude. She still kept her garden in perfect order, though, a spread of vibrant roses and azaleas framing her small yellow-painted house. As Eddie slowed down to get a better look, he saw that she was wrestling with an old clock, a large wooden mantelpiece clock with brass detailing that gleamed faintly in the afternoon light. Her face wore a mask of concentration and frustration as she fiddled with its gears, her delicate hands working clumsily over the intricate mechanics. Without hesitation, Eddie parked his bike at the curb and made his way up her front steps, raising a hand in greeting. "Hey, Mrs. Parker, everything all right?" he asked, his voice warm but hesitant. Mrs. Marlene looked up, her face softening into a gentle smile as she recognized him. "Oh, Eddie, I didn't mean to look so troubled," she replied, sighing softly. "It's just this old clock. Belonged to my husband. It's been in our family for years, but lately it just won't tick anymore. I'm afraid I don't know the first thing about fixing it." Eddie's eyes lit up. He loved working with gadgets and had a natural knack for fixing things. "Maybe I can take a look," he offered, stepping closer. "I'm pretty good with electronics and stuff." Mrs. Marlene hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her smile growing a little wider. "That would be very kind of you, Eddie. I'd really appreciate it." With a gentle touch, Eddie lifted the clock, turning it over carefully to examine its inner workings. As he inspected the gears and tiny mechanisms, he felt a deep respect for the craftsmanship and history in the object. This was more than just a clock. It was a piece of Mrs. Marlene's past, a relic from the life she'd built with her husband. After a few minutes of tinkering, Eddie found a loose connection inside the clock and, with a few quick adjustments, managed to restore the mechanism to its proper alignment. With a satisfying tick, the clock's hands began to move, a steady rhythm filling the silence between them. Mrs. Marlene's eyes filled with awe as she watched. "You did it!" she exclaimed softly, her voice thick with emotion. She placed a hand over her heart, her face breaking into a smile that made her look years younger. "Oh, Eddie, thank you so much. This clock, it was a gift from my husband. He always said it kept time as steadily as his heart did for me. You've brought it back to life." Eddie felt a warmth spread through him as he met her gaze. "I'm glad I could help," he said, brushing a bit of dust from his hands. He couldn't help but feel a surge of pride, knowing that he'd done something meaningful. "Would you like to come inside for some cookies?" Mrs. Marlene asked, her voice soft and inviting. "I made a fresh batch this morning, and it's the least I can do to thank you." Eddie's eyes sparkled at the mention of cookies. "That sounds awesome, Mrs. Parker. Thank you." As they stepped inside, the cozy warmth of her home enveloped him, the walls lined with photos of a life filled with memories. She led him to the kitchen, setting out a plate of cookies and a glass of milk, her movements gentle and practiced. Eddie savored the first bite, the soft, chocolatey warmth melting in his mouth, as Mrs. Marlene settled across from him. For the next half hour, they talked and laughed, sharing stories and memories. Mrs. Marlene's face lit up as she recounted tales from her youth, adventures she'd had with her late husband, and little snippets of neighborhood history that Eddie had never heard before. Her voice softened as she spoke of her husband, the love and companionship they had shared, and the quiet, empty space that had filled her life since he passed. And Eddie listened, really listened, in a way that he hadn't before. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and cast a warm, golden light through the window, Eddie felt a strange sense of peace. He hadn't just fixed a clock that afternoon. He'd forged a connection. As he left her house, Eddie felt lighter somehow, as if he'd uncovered something precious and irreplaceable. The warm glow of Mrs. Marlene's gratitude stayed with him as he biked home, his thoughts swirling with a newfound sense of purpose and fulfillment. The next morning, Eddie awoke with a sense of accomplishment from the previous day. He could still recall the look of gratitude on Mrs. Marlene's face, the way her eyes had shone with warmth and appreciation. He hadn't thought much about it at the time, but now, in the quiet of his room, he realized just how much it meant to him to have helped her. He felt different, like he'd made a small difference in the world, starting right in his own neighborhood. As Eddie came downstairs, he was greeted by the familiar smell of his mom's pancakes sizzling on the stove. His dad sat at the kitchen table, reading the paper with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. "Morning, champ," his dad greeted him, glancing over the top of the newspaper. "You were out pretty late yesterday." "Yeah, I was over at Mrs. Parker's," Eddie replied, as he reached for a plate. "Her clock wasn't working, so I helped fix it." His mom turned from the stove, a proud smile on her face. "That's very kind of you, Eddie. Mrs. Parker must have been thrilled." "She was," Eddie said, grinning as he recalled her reaction. "She even gave me cookies." As the morning passed, Eddie's thoughts returned to Mrs. Marlene and the stories she'd shared with him. He had listened to her tales about her husband's love for watches, his career as a mechanic, and the way they had worked together to build a life filled with memories. It made him feel as if he had been granted a glimpse into her world, a world filled with love, resilience, and dedication. Around midday, as Eddie was relaxing in the living room, he heard a knock at the front door. Curious, he got up and opened the door, only to find Mrs. Marlene standing on his porch. Next to her was a tall man in a police uniform. Eddie's heart skipped a beat, and he felt a jolt of nervousness. Why would Mrs. Marlene be here with a police officer? "Good afternoon, Eddie," Mrs. Marlene greeted him, her face lighting up with a gentle smile. "I hope I'm not intruding." Eddie managed a smile, though he couldn't hide his confusion. No, not at all. Is everything okay?" She chuckled softly, glancing at the officer beside her. "Yes, dear, everything is fine. I'm here to thank you. Officer Matthews here helped me pick something up. Something special, just for you." Eddie's curiosity piqued as he looked between Mrs. Marlene and Officer Matthews. The officer gave him a reassuring nod, reaching into his bag and pulling out a small, neatly wrapped package. He handed it to Mrs. Marlene, who extended it toward Eddie. "This is for you, Eddie," Mrs. Marlene said, her voice thick with emotion. "For all the kindness you've shown me, you've done so much more than fix an old clock. You've reminded me of what it means to feel cared for. I wanted to show you how grateful I am." Eddie took the package from her, feeling a mixture of surprise and humility. He hadn't expected anything in return for helping her. It was just something he'd done because it felt right. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. You didn't have to get me anything." Mrs. Marlene smiled warmly. "Open it, dear." With curious anticipation, Eddie carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a small polished silver compass nestled in a velvet-lined box. The compass was old but beautifully preserved, with intricate designs etched into its casing. Eddie noticed an inscription on the back. "May this guide you on all the paths ahead." "This compass belonged to my husband," Mrs. Marlene explained, her eyes glistening. "He carried it with him everywhere he went, even when he traveled for work. It's a reminder to always find your way, no matter how lost you might feel. I think he would have wanted you to have it. You have a heart as kind and true as his, Eddie." Eddie's eyes widened as he held the compass, feeling the weight of its history in his hands. "Mrs. Parker, I don't know what to say. This is incredible." Officer Matthews, who had been silently observing, gave Eddie an approving nod. "Mrs. Parker told me how much your gesture meant to her. You've done a fine thing, son. It's a good reminder that kindness and community still matter. You make your neighborhood proud." Eddie felt his chest swell with pride, yet also with a sense of responsibility. This compass was more than a gift. It was a symbol of trust and respect. a bond that had grown between him and Mrs. Marlene. "I promise to take care of it," Eddie said, his voice full of gratitude and sincerity. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker." Mrs. Marlene placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I know you will, Eddie. And remember, you're welcome to come visit any time. I always have more stories to share and fresh cookies to go around." Eddie grinned, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I'll definitely take you up on that offer, Mrs. Parker." As she turned to leave with Officer Matthews, Eddie watched them go, clutching the compass tightly. This small gesture, a simple act of kindness, had blossomed into something far more meaningful. He felt connected to Mrs. Marlene in a way he hadn't expected, as if he had gained a new family member in his life. And from that day on, Eddie knew that he'd be there for her, just as she had already been there for him. Eddie couldn't stop thinking about the compass Mrs. Marlene had gifted him. Every time he glanced at it, he felt a warmth that was both humbling and uplifting, as though he'd been entrusted with something precious, a piece of her history, her memories, and her trust. It felt as though the compass wasn't just an object, but a guide, showing him the way not only on streets and paths, but also on the journey of kindness and connection he had embarked upon with Mrs. Marlene. In the days that followed, Eddie made it a habit to visit her regularly. After school, he would often find himself walking down Maple Street, past the familiar yellow house with its well-kept garden and rose bushes. Mrs. Marlene would always be there, either tending to her flowers or sitting on her porch with a book. She would greet him with a warm smile, and together they would settle into a comfortable routine of companionship. One crisp autumn afternoon, Eddie arrived at Mrs. Marlene's house to find her attempting to lift a heavy box in her garage. "Mrs. Parker, let me help you with that," he called, rushing over to take the box from her. "Oh, Eddie, thank you, dear. I was just trying to organize a few things," she replied, a bit breathless but smiling gratefully. She led him into the garage, which was filled with boxes and odds and ends, relics of a life filled with stories and memories. As Eddie helped her arrange the boxes, they chatted about everything under the sun. Mrs. Marlene shared stories about her youth, the adventures she'd had with her husband, and the lessons she'd learned along the way. Her voice would soften as she spoke of him, her eyes twinkling with nostalgia and warmth. Eddie listened intently, fascinated by her tales. She spoke of times that felt worlds away from his own, yet somehow he felt connected to her stories, as if they were teaching him lessons that transcended generations. One day, after finishing their tasks in the garage, Mrs. Marlene offered him a seat on her porch. "Let me get you some lemonade," she said, disappearing inside. Eddie settled into the chair, looking around at her garden and feeling a sense of peace that he rarely found elsewhere. Soon, Mrs. Marlene returned with 2 glasses of lemonade and a plate of freshly baked cookies. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker," Eddie said, taking a sip. The lemonade was tangy and sweet, the perfect refresher after their afternoon of organizing. "You know, Eddie," Mrs. Marlene began, her voice softer now, "I've been alone for a long time. Since Henry passed, it's just been me here. I have family, of course, but they live far away and visits are few and far between." Eddie felt a pang in his heart as he listened. He couldn't imagine what it must feel like to live in a house filled with memories, but no longer with the people who created them. "I'm glad I can be here with you," he said quietly, looking into her kind eyes. "You're like family to me too, Mrs. Parker." Her face softened with emotion, and she reached over to pat his hand. "That means the world to me, Eddie. And, I must say, you've brought a light into my life that I thought I'd lost. Just having someone to talk to share stories with, it makes the days feel a little brighter." From that day on, Eddie's visits became a regular part of his life. He found himself looking forward to their afternoons together, not just because he enjoyed Mrs. Marlene's stories, but because he could see how much it meant to her to have someone to share them with. Sometimes they would sit on the porch, sipping lemonade or hot cocoa, depending on the weather, and talk for hours. Other times, he would help her with small chores around the house or in the garden, tasks that had become more difficult for her over the years. With each visit, Eddie felt himself growing. Mrs. Marlene's wisdom and life experiences were shaping him in ways he hadn't expected. He learned about patience, kindness, and the importance of listening. Her stories taught him about resilience, about finding strength in the face of hardship, and about the importance of keeping loved ones close, even when they're far away. And as the seasons changed, their friendship deepened. Mrs. Marlene became more than just a neighbor. She became a confidant, a guide, and, in many ways, a grandmother he'd never had. And for Mrs. Marlene, Eddie became the grandson she'd always dreamed of, an attentive listener, a compassionate soul, and a reminder of the joy that could still be found in life's quiet, simple moments. One chilly evening, as the leaves began to turn golden and the air held a crispness that hinted at winter's approach, Eddie sat with Mrs. Marlene on her porch. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange as the sun began to set. She looked over at him with a warm smile, her eyes filled with pride and affection. "You know, Eddie, it's rare to find young people who are so kind-hearted and genuine. I'm grateful every day that you took the time to stop and help an old woman with a broken clock," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Eddie smiled, looking down at the compass that hung from a chain around his neck. "And I'm grateful that you trusted me with this," he replied, touching the cool, polished surface of the compass. "It's a reminder of everything you and Mr. Parker have taught me." As they sat together in the fading light, Eddie felt a deep sense of gratitude for Mrs. Marlene and the friendship they had formed. It was a bond that he knew would last, a connection that had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. And in his heart, he knew that as long as he had the compass, he would always find his way back to her. Eddie's days had settled into a fulfilling routine. Every afternoon, he would finish school, rush home to finish his homework, and then head over to Mrs. Marlene's house. These visits had become his favorite part of the day, a sanctuary where he felt understood and appreciated. They talked about everything under the sun, from her stories of the past to his dreams for the future. But one day, something was bothering Eddie deeply, and Mrs. Marlene noticed as soon as he walked through the door. "Eddie, dear, you seem troubled today," she said gently, as he sat down at the kitchen table, a deep frown creasing his forehead. Eddie sighed, pulling a crumpled math test from his backpack and laying it on the table. A large red D was circled at the top of the page. "I tried so hard, Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I studied for hours, but I still failed. Maybe I'm just not good at math." Mrs. Marlene looked at him with a compassionate smile, her wise eyes full of understanding. She reached out and placed her hand on his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Oh, Eddie, you remind me so much of Henry, my late husband," she began. "When he was young, he struggled with certain things too. You see, he wasn't a natural when it came to the intricacies of his trade. He was a clockmaker, and his hands weren't steady, nor did he have the patience for the delicate work at first, but he didn't give up." Eddie looked up, intrigued. He had always admired the clock that she treasured, not knowing much about the man who had crafted it. "Really? How did he manage to do it then?" "Well," Mrs. Marlene said, her voice filled with admiration, "Henry had a mentor, much like you have me. And he had perseverance. He would practice every day, sometimes for hours, until he got it right. He would take apart old clocks, fix them, and put them back together again. He believed that if he just put in enough effort and learned from his mistakes, he could overcome any challenge." Eddie's gaze fell on his math test again. Her words sparked a glimmer of hope within him. "So he just kept trying?" "That's right, dear." Henry knew that mistakes were just stepping stones. Every time he failed, he learned something new and improved. And before he knew it, he became one of the most respected clockmakers in the town. People came from all over to have their clocks fixed by him. Eddie sat in thoughtful silence, absorbing her words. The idea of perseverance and learning from failure made him feel a bit better, but doubt still lingered. "What if I'm just not smart enough?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Mrs. Marlene shook her head firmly. "Smart isn't always about getting things right the first time, Eddie. It's about persistence, about learning, about asking for help when you need it. It's about the journey, not the destination." She offered him a soft, encouraging smile. "Would you like me to help you go over your math problems? We can work through them together, just as Henry did with his clocks. I believe you have the potential, Eddie, just like Henry did." Eddie nodded slowly, feeling the weight on his shoulders lighten. Together, they spent the next hour going over his math problems. Mrs. Marlene explained each concept in a way that made sense to him, using examples from everyday life. Her patience and encouragement gave him the confidence he needed to tackle each question. and by the end of their session, Eddie felt a renewed sense of determination. In the weeks that followed, Eddie dedicated himself to his studies with a new vigor. He stayed after school to get extra help from his math teacher, practiced problems with Mrs. Marlene, and even asked his parents to quiz him in the evenings. Slowly but surely, he began to understand the concepts that had once seemed so confusing. Then, the day of the next math test arrived. Eddie sat in his classroom, gripping his pencil tightly. He could feel a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach, but he took a deep breath and remembered Mrs. Marlene's words. Mistakes are stepping stones. With each question he answered, he felt more confident, and by the time he finished, he knew he had done his best. A few days later, his math teacher returned their tests. Eddie's hands trembled as he took his paper and looked at the grade. There, at the top of the page, was a bright, shining B+. A grin spread across his face, and his heart felt like it was going to burst. He had done it. All the hard work, the late nights, the extra help, it had paid off. As soon as the bell rang, he dashed out of the classroom and pedaled his bike as fast as he could to Mrs. Marlene's house. He burst through her door, unable to contain his excitement. "Mrs. Parker, I did it!" he shouted, holding up his test paper proudly. "I got a B+ on my math test." Mrs. Marlene's eyes sparkled with pride, and she opened her arms wide, pulling him into a warm hug. "Oh, Eddie, I knew you could do it," she exclaimed. "I am so proud of you." Eddie beamed, his heart swelling with joy. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. I couldn't have done it without your help. You taught me to keep trying, just like Mr. Henry." She smiled, brushing a proud tear from her cheek. "You did all the hard work, Eddie. I just gave you a little push. But remember, the next time you face a challenge, you have the strength and determination to overcome it." Eddie looked down at the compass hanging from his neck, feeling the weight of its significance. This was more than just a piece of history. It was a reminder of the lessons Mrs. Marlene had shared with him and the strength he had discovered within himself. As he left her house that day, Eddie felt a new sense of confidence. He knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he had the resilience to face them. He could persevere, learn from his mistakes, and find his way, just as Mrs. Marlene and her late husband had taught him. As the days grew shorter and the warmth of summer faded, the Johnson family found themselves thinking more and more about Mrs. Marlene. Eddie had shared so many stories about their afternoons together, her wisdom, her stories about Henry, and her kindness, that they all felt as though she was already a part of their family. So, one Friday evening, Eddie's mother suggested something that brought an instant smile to his face. "Eddie," she said over dinner, "why don't we invite Mrs. Marlene over for dinner this Sunday? I'd love to meet her properly, and I know you've become so close." Eddie's eyes lit up with excitement. "Really? That would be amazing. I know she'd love that, Mom." The next day, Eddie eagerly invited Mrs. Marlene, who accepted with a warm smile and a touch of surprise. "Oh, Eddie," she said, her voice laced with joy and gratitude. "I'd be honored. It's been so long since I've had a family dinner." When Sunday evening arrived, the Johnsons prepared a hearty meal, filling their home with the comforting aromas of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and homemade rolls. Eddie waited by the door, watching the driveway with anticipation. When Mrs. Marlene arrived, dressed in her best, her eyes sparkled as she took in the lively scene inside the house. She seemed a little nervous, but Eddie quickly pulled her in with a reassuring smile. "Mrs. Marlene, welcome," he said, taking her coat and guiding her into the cozy dining room. Eddie's parents greeted her warmly, and they all took their seats around the table. As they began to eat, Eddie's mom broke the ice with a friendly smile. "Eddie tells us so much about you, Mrs. Parker. Thank you for being such a wonderful friend to him." Mrs. Marlene smiled, her face softening as she looked over at Eddie. "The pleasure is truly mine. Eddie has been such a blessing. He's filled my days with laughter and kindness, and he reminds me so much of my late husband, Henry." Eddie's father nodded, raising his glass in a small toast. "To friendship and family. We're so grateful for the bond you two have formed." The warmth of the moment touched Mrs. Marlene deeply. As they continued eating, she shared stories about Henry's adventures as a clockmaker and how they'd met in a small-town dance hall. The Johnsons listened intently, laughing at her tales and marveling at her life experiences. The room filled with laughter, nostalgia, and the ease of newfound companionship. Eddie felt a deep happiness watching his family connect with Mrs. Marlene. She wasn't just his friend. She was becoming someone truly special to all of them. After dessert, as the night wound down, Mrs. Marlene stood up to leave, but Eddie's mother stopped her gently. "Mrs. Marlene, we've been thinking," she began, exchanging a glance with Eddie's father. "You've become such an important part of Eddie's life, and ours too. We'd love for you to join us more often, not just tonight, but whenever you'd like. You're always welcome here." Mrs. Marlene's eyes welled with tears, and she pressed a hand to her heart. "You have no idea how much that means to me. I've been alone for so long, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have family around." Eddie wrapped his arms around her, his voice a little choked. "You are family, Mrs. Marlene." The Johnsons all gathered around her, embracing her warmly. For the first time in years, Mrs. Marlene felt a true sense of belonging. She had found a family again, not through blood, but through kindness and connection. From that day on, Mrs. Marlene became a fixture in the Johnson household. Sunday dinners became a cherished tradition, with her joining them each week, bringing her own baked treats and new stories to share. She helped Eddie with his homework, cheered him on at school events, and became a loving grandmother figure not only to Eddie, but to the entire family. Eddie felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The once simple act of kindness that had brought them together had grown into something beautiful and enduring. His bond with Mrs. Marlene had become a bridge that connected two families, filling both their lives with love and joy. As Eddie's friendship with Mrs. Marlene continued to grow, he found himself inspired by her stories of generosity and compassion. She often spoke of her late husband Henry's belief in giving back to the community, a principle he lived by throughout his life. Hearing about Henry's legacy lit a spark in Eddie's heart, and he started thinking about ways he could make a difference in his own neighborhood. One Saturday morning, Eddie approached Mrs. Marlene with a big idea. "Mrs. Marlene, do you think we could do something to help out around here? Maybe organize a little cleanup or a food drive?" Mrs. Marlene's eyes twinkled with pride as she listened. "Oh, Eddie, I think that's a wonderful idea. There's always a need in the community, and I'm sure your enthusiasm will inspire others. Let's see what we can do together." They decided to start with a simple community cleanup. Mrs. Marlene and Eddie went door to door, inviting neighbors to join. Eddie's friendly smile and enthusiasm were contagious, and soon, many families and even some of his friends from school agreed to pitch in. On the day of the cleanup, Eddie and Mrs. Marlene arrived early at the park, armed with gloves, trash bags, and a sense of purpose. They were soon joined by a handful of neighbors, including Eddie's parents, some classmates, and other families from the community. As they worked together, picking up litter and clearing debris, Eddie felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He noticed how people began to chat, laugh, and share stories as they worked side by side. After the cleanup, they all gathered for a small picnic that Mrs. Marlene had organized, complete with homemade sandwiches and her famous chocolate chip cookies. The air was filled with laughter and the sounds of children playing nearby. Looking around at the smiling faces, Eddie realized the impact of his and Mrs. Marlene's efforts. It wasn't just about cleaning up the park. It was about bringing people together and fostering a sense of belonging. Seeing how successful the event had been, Eddie was inspired to do more. He asked Mrs. Marlene if they could help at the local community center, and she happily agreed. Over the following weeks, they started volunteering together in various ways, sorting donations at the food bank, organizing after-school activities for kids, and even assisting in setting up a small library section with donated books. Eddie found that he loved the feeling of helping others, and his passion quickly caught on. His friends began joining him on volunteer days, and soon, even his teachers noticed his dedication to giving back. One day, his social studies teacher pulled him aside after class. "Eddie," she said with a warm smile, "your involvement in the community is inspiring. You're setting a great example for others, and I'm proud to have you as a student." Eddie blushed, a mixture of pride and humility in his heart. He hadn't expected his actions to be noticed. He simply felt a need to do something good, just as Henry had. But it was rewarding to see how his efforts were making a positive impact on the people around him. As Eddie's reputation for kindness and dedication grew, he found himself becoming a role model for other teens in the neighborhood. Younger kids started looking up to him, often asking if they could join him on his volunteer projects. Eddie welcomed them with open arms, thrilled to see more and more people getting involved in acts of kindness. One afternoon, while sorting donations at the community center with Mrs. Marlene, Eddie paused to look around. The room was buzzing with energy as volunteers of all ages worked together, chatting and laughing as they packed food boxes and organized supplies. He felt a swell of pride and gratitude, knowing that his simple desire to help had blossomed into a larger movement within the community. He turned to Mrs. Marlene, his eyes bright with emotion. "This feels incredible, Mrs. Marlene. I never imagined so many people would want to help out." Mrs. Marlene smiled and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Eddie, you've done something truly special. Henry always believed that kindness was contagious, and you've proven him right. You've shown this community the power of compassion, and you've brought people together in ways I couldn't have imagined." Eddie nodded, feeling a deep sense of purpose. He knew that this was only the beginning, that there were endless opportunities to give back and make a difference. And with Mrs. Marlene by his side, he was determined to continue this journey, one act of kindness at a time. Eddie's efforts in the community had become a powerful example of compassion and unity. As the weeks turned into months, his bond with Mrs. Marlene only grew stronger. Their afternoons together were filled with laughter, stories, and sometimes quiet moments of reflection. Through these moments, Eddie felt he was gaining not just a friend, but a mentor who taught him valuable life lessons about resilience, kindness, and courage. One sunny afternoon, Eddie arrived at Mrs. Marlene's house for their usual visit. As he stepped inside, he noticed a box on the coffee table, carefully wrapped in a soft cloth. Mrs. Marlene sat beside it, her eyes sparkling with both excitement and a touch of nostalgia. "Come, Eddie," she gestured for him to sit next to her. "There's something I want to give you." Eddie's eyes widened in curiosity as he took a seat. He looked from the box to Mrs. Marlene, wondering what could be inside. Gently, she unfolded the cloth to reveal an antique pocket watch, polished to a gleaming shine. The watch was beautifully crafted, its surface etched with intricate designs and a faint inscription on the back. "This watch," Mrs. Marlene began softly, "belonged to Henry. He wore it every day of his life. To him, it symbolized his commitment to making the world a better place." Eddie's gaze lingered on the watch, awed by its beauty and the history it held. He knew from her stories how deeply Henry had cared for his community, how he had dedicated his life to helping others, and how the watch had accompanied him on that journey. "I want you to have it, Eddie," Mrs. Marlene said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've shown the same kindness, strength, and dedication that Henry always believed in. This watch should go to someone who carries that same spirit." Eddie was speechless. He looked up at Mrs. Marlene, his heart swelling with gratitude and disbelief. "Mrs. Marlene, I don't know what to say. This is too important, too precious." She reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his. "You are important, Eddie. You've brought life back into my world, and you've inspired this entire community with your actions. This watch is not just a gift. It's a reminder of who you are and the impact you can have on others." With trembling hands, Eddie accepted the watch, feeling the cool metal against his skin. He carefully opened it, revealing the delicate clockwork inside, ticking with quiet strength. It felt as though the watch held a heartbeat of its own, a legacy of kindness passed down from one generation to the next. As he fastened the watch around his wrist, Eddie looked up at Mrs. Marlene, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I promise I'll live up to this. I'll keep doing everything I can to help others, just like Henry did." Mrs. Marlene's eyes shone with pride as she smiled warmly. "I know you will, Eddie. That's why I chose you. I trust you'll carry this legacy forward." The weight of the watch on Eddie's wrist felt like both an honor and a responsibility. It reminded him of the values he had learned, not only from Mrs. Marlene, but also from the entire experience of helping his community. He knew that this was a commitment, a pledge to continue giving, supporting, and uplifting others. That evening, as Eddie walked home with the watch ticking steadily on his wrist, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This small symbolic gift was now his reminder to carry Henry's legacy of kindness, courage, and dedication, and he vowed to live up to it, one act of kindness at a time. With the pocket watch now a permanent reminder on his wrist, Eddie's relationship with Mrs. Marlene grew deeper, and, in a way, his entire family embraced her as their own. She had become a staple at their dinners, often sharing stories of the past with a warmth that filled every corner of their home. Eddie's parents welcomed her as they would a cherished aunt, and his younger siblings were enamored with her tales and treats. One Sunday afternoon, Eddie's family decided to host a small picnic at the local park. They invited Mrs. Marlene, who arrived wearing a straw hat and carrying a basket of homemade cookies, her usual energy mixed with a visible excitement. The park was bustling with children playing, families laughing, and the lively hum of community gatherings. Eddie helped Mrs. Marlene settle under the shade of a large oak tree, ensuring she had a comfortable spot to enjoy the day. As the family shared food and stories, Eddie couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. He saw the joy on Mrs. Marlene's face, how she laughed with his mother and chatted comfortably with his father. In this shared space, with everyone coming together, it felt like a beautiful blending of their worlds. Throughout the afternoon, Eddie noticed how easily Mrs. Marlene fit into his family's rhythm. She cheered on his siblings as they played games, and even taught them a few tricks to win a round of charades. For a moment, as they all laughed together, Eddie imagined this as a new tradition, a part of his family life where Mrs. Marlene's presence was a given, and the line between friend and family had blurred entirely. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the park, Eddie and Mrs. Marlene found themselves walking along a nearby path. Mrs. Marlene sighed, looking out at the sunset. "It's been so long since I felt like I truly belonged somewhere, Eddie. Your family, they've welcomed me in a way I never expected." Eddie glanced down at the watch on his wrist, feeling its comforting weight. "You are family to us now, Mrs. Marlene. You've given us so much more than you realize. I think we were all meant to find each other." She reached out, gently squeezing his hand. "You're right, Eddie. Sometimes family isn't about blood. It's about the people who open their hearts to each other. I feel blessed to be a part of yours." They continued to walk in silence, each step a quiet affirmation of the bond they had forged, a bond that was rooted in kindness, shared stories, and a commitment to always be there for one another. That evening, as they packed up the picnic and headed home, Eddie felt a renewed sense of purpose and love for the people around him. It wasn't just about the legacy of the watch or the lessons he'd learned. It was about cherishing the connections that truly mattered. As the seasons turned and Eddie prepared to leave for college, he found himself spending more time with Mrs. Marlene. Their routine walks, shared stories, and quiet afternoons at her cozy home took on a bittersweet quality. They both knew that Eddie's departure marked a significant change in their lives, but they approached it with a shared resilience and understanding. One late summer evening, Eddie arrived at Mrs. Marlene's house for one final visit before heading off to school. The air was warm, and the sky was painted with soft hues of pink and orange. Mrs. Marlene was waiting for him on the porch, her usual smile touched with a hint of sadness. As they sat together, Eddie handed her a small journal wrapped in a blue ribbon. "I wanted to give you something before I left," he said, his voice quiet yet sincere. "Inside, I wrote down all the things I've learned from you, about kindness, resilience, family, and everything in between. I figured it was time I tried to give something back." Mrs. Marlene's eyes welled up as she gently opened the journal, skimming the heartfelt entries Eddie had penned. Each page held memories and lessons, filled with moments they had shared over the past year. She looked up, touched beyond words. "Eddie, this is beautiful. I will cherish it always." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun dip lower on the horizon. Finally, Mrs. Marlene spoke. "I want you to know, Eddie, that no matter where you go, you'll always have a home here. I'll be right here, rooting for you, every step of the way." Eddie reached for the pocket watch on his wrist, feeling its familiar weight and the comfort it brought him. "I promise I'll visit as often as I can, and I'll carry everything you've taught me with me, always." As they shared their last hug for now, both felt the weight of this goodbye, yet they knew it wasn't truly an end. It was the start of a new chapter for both of them, rooted in the lessons they had shared and the family they had chosen to become. When Eddie walked away from Mrs. Marlene's porch that evening, he felt a profound sense of peace. He knew that, no matter where life took him, their bond would remain unbroken. a testament to the power of kindness, love, and the connections that define us. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.